Paddy and Tony for stimulating this event this afternoon. I got a call from, or I got an email from Paddy, and I spoke with Tony, and they were looking for a title to have a session focused on digital transformation in financial services. So we came up with an exciting title. We think, at least, it's doomed to slow progress, but we'd like to debate that this afternoon and see where there is fast progress or slow progress. We've an exciting panel this afternoon. Everyone can see the bios. I would just like to note that Emma and Gerry are speaking in their roles as adjunct professors in the business school in UCC, even though they're affiliated with their with the Department of Finance and the Central Bank, but they are speaking in their role as adjunct professors. So without further ado, we're just going to go straight into it. So I have a question here for Emma, first of all, because this has always intrigued me that Irish people really don't understand the role of the Department of Finance when it comes to policy making in Ireland. I think they underplay it too much. What are your thoughts on that, Emma? You're muted off there, Emma, sorry.
Oh, that's a good start. Thanks, JB. I'm delighted to be here. I think that's a good question. I suppose when people talk about the Department of Finance, they probably primarily think of the budget maybe and the economic work that we do. But actually, as a department, we're just over 300 staff, and we're involved in lots of various areas: budget, economic, tax, financial services, international, IMF, World Bank, EU, etc. In terms of financial services, our role is very much as the policymaker, and the sort of occupying the Irish seat in European negotiations that set the policy for financial services. So we do it through a couple of ways. Increasingly, policy is driven at a global and a European level in the area of financial services. So we represent Ireland as the negotiator at those negotiations, assisted by the Central Bank, who are very much our technical advisors in those issues. And we just negotiate the policy. We then, what we would call, transpose it or bring it into Irish legislation. So we develop the legislation which is brought through the Oireachtas, and then ultimately is, for the Central Bank to implement and to regulate and to supervise and to engage with individual firms on how that policy operates on the ground. So, it's probably not as often visible what we do, but we're an important player in the field of the development of financial services policy.
Very good, Emma. Gerry, I think the role of the Central Bank actually might be overplayed when it comes to policy making from the consumer's perspective. And I realize that they have a huge linkages externally to other European bodies. Maybe you'd like to say a few words on that?
Yeah, thanks, JB, and delighted to be here this afternoon. I don't know about doomed to slow progress. Maybe the question or the subtext is what's a safe pace of progress, at least from a regulatory point of view, and maybe we'll come back to that during the session. In relation to your question, I mean, we have a very broad mandate, so I'm not at all surprised that there sometimes can be a degree of confusion, and we tend to find ourselves regularly reported on. But like everything we do is effectively governed by, in terms of our mandate, by legislation. And a lot of what we're doing is effectively based on legislation, either the legislation that is national legislation here, a huge amount of it from the European Commission as it gets transposed locally, as Emma has said. And then we have, for example, a role as part of the European system of central banks, where our governor sits on the governing council. So all of our monetary policies, right, associated with financial stability are very much part of the collective of the Euro system. And that takes us into areas of policy around cash and cash going forward, which again is a Euro system policy. But also we're very strongly connected to policies and initiatives that come through from the European Banking Authority, for the European Securities and Markets Authority, from EIOPA in terms of pensions, etc. And then we have our other role, which is our consumer protection role, which is to ensure that we have the right protections in place. So it is a very broad mandate, JB, and we work very closely then with our colleagues in the Department of Finance to execute the policy as Emma has mentioned, and help with the technical advice as well.
Very good. Tony, when it comes to when it comes to the startups that you're working with, the FinTechs, how are you dealing with regulation when they hit regulation? Do they know when to stay outside it? Where's the regulatory perimeter? When do they need help? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, JB. Yeah, look, my view would be engage early and engage often, because there's no point in leaving this to the last minute. I think within this whole area, what we have is people who come from a financial services background, so they came from a regulated entity, they tend to know what's required, or at least they're aware that there will be requirements. People that come from the outside, so from a technology background or whatnot, they're not necessarily as tuned into the need to engage and talk about this. And we've seen in the UK there only in the last 2 weeks an issue with Lannister where they were talking to the markets about what they were doing. It was interpreted that they were offering the services. The FCA came out and said, hang on, they're not regulated to do that. And they had to come back and explain, no, actually, we're only talking about what we will do in the future. So I would say engage early, engage often, and make sure everyone is on the same page here, JB.
Very good. Efi, coming to you to give us some non-Irish perspective on this. Where are people moving fast? Are we slow or fast if we look at within Europe, within Switzerland, within the US? Give us some context.
Well, I mean, if you really want fast, you have to look to the east. That's clear, because simply they don't have the maturity of financial regulation over there, and basically all financial innovation was built out by technology firms, what we call tech fins, companies like Alibaba, like Tencent, like JD.com, and so on. So fast is there. But I don't think that, we in Europe, we should look at that and try to see what we can adopt. I mean, we can in terms of looking at the business model, but from a regulatory perspective, not really. If we look to the US, which is troubled by the fact that it is fragmented with multiple regulatory bodies, still there, I would say, our mentality is we want fast because we're spoiled by the growth of, again, technology firms and the attention economy, and that's not the case for financial services. And I must say that at the end of the day, if I look, for example, in payments, right, we have big firms like PayPal, for example, that have grown without the regulatory rigidity of a licensed bank. They have found ways, like the credit card companies, to circumvent cross-state complications. Basically, in a nutshell, what they do is they take advantage of a model, the banking as a service model. They go and partner with a national bank, and they can do their business. And that's why in the US, you see, in my opinion, the highest growth rate of banking as a service sector. There's many examples there of companies like Green Dot and Marqeta and so on. In Europe, we see less of that. We have them. Examples are Rails Bank and Solaris Bank and Fidor and so on. I think that we're going to be seeing more of that kind of growth.
Emma, maybe with just leading on from that, with PSD2 and AISPs and PISPs, whatever, I think we seem to be heading in that direction. It might seem to take a long time, but there is consensus that building in Europe that has to happen before we move with PSD2 or PSD3. Could you add to that?
Yeah, I agree very much with what you say there, JB, and what Efi has said. It can seem like we're making slow progress, but actually when you look back over where we've got to over the last few years, a lot has changed. And I think payments is a great example of where actually a lot has changed in the last few years. And a lot of that has actually been driven by regulation. Regulation has been sort of the thing that has facilitated a lot of this. And, it can seem slow. payment services, the first directive is now, it was 2007, I think, when that was proposed. It was updated by Payment Services Directive 2. That was proposed, I think, in 2013. Member states discussed it for a year. That was 2014. Then it went into discussions with the Parliament, European Parliament. That was maybe 2015, had to go through the lawyers. So it was kind of the end of 2015 before you had a text. And then member states had 2 years to bring it into their national legislation. So it was actually 2018 before it took effect. So I can see why you might give criticism when things are moving slowly. But actually, that will be a huge facilitator of change, and potentially fast change down the line, because it has allowed new players into the market. It opened up banking. It has seen that data is a really important part of financial services and driving of digital change. And it has basically mandated that the banks have to open up their systems and open up their data for other players in the market. So it's a long time coming sometimes, but actually it can be a big facilitator of change.
Very good. Tony, maybe just keeping on that theme with of big tech being able to facilitate big change in the financial services space. I think they definitely have the money, they have the connection to the consumer, and there's definitely a fear factor for the incumbents. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting space, JP. On one hand, the big techs want to be in this space. On the other hand, they don't necessarily want to be regulated as financial institutions. So I think what we've seen is probably more in the space of collaboration, as Emma was saying there, in terms of we've seen the likes of, even the likes of Uber, when they come into a market, they partnered with BBVA Mexico. We've seen Amazon and others partner. I think what they're really good at, JB, is they're really good at understanding customers. They're really good at understanding data and being able to preempt customers' needs. What they don't have is, the skill sets necessarily to work through a regulated environment, nor probably the desire to be fully regulated either. So I think we're kind of in transition, but my sense is there's more collaboration than competition in this space.
Very good. And Gerry, just on the consumer protection and financial stability, which the CBI has obviously is playing the key role, that is challenged more and more by all these new forms of access and new targeted applications at consumers, some of which are very vulnerable, elderly consumers, people that are not used to technology. What are your thoughts on the progress there? Is there a fear that we might marginalize some sections of society? You're muted off there, Gerry, I think.
Yeah, thanks, JB. Sorry. I mean, I think inherently, innovation is good, but not all innovations are good, and not all good innovations are implemented well, right? So you've got to look at it in that particular way. And to go back to what Tony said earlier on, certainly in terms of firms getting into this space, engaging with us as soon as possible, which is why we set an innovation hub up about 2 years ago, so that firms can make contact with us to try and understand the regulatory landscape, because as others have said, I think particularly some firms are really not familiar with it. So they have a good idea, they have good technology, but actually they don't really understand the kind of the policy areas that are impacted as a consequence of that. And certainly, I mean, we produced a note last week, I think it was some of my colleagues, in relation to differential pricing in the insurance sector. And the point that was made there is there's technology now that allows differential pricing down to very specific levels, but there's a huge set of policy questions there in relation to whether using that differential pricing is good or is not good. It can be good, right? But equally, certain categories of consumer can be excluded from that particular area. So these policy considerations, right, have to be considered and dealt with to see what the policy reactions are in respect of it. So it's a very interesting question for us as regulators and central bankers, not just us here in Ireland, but the whole community, is how do we keep pace with all of these developments, and how do we ensure that we have the correct policy responses in place? And to go back to Emma's point, that can take time because there are so many considerations and complexities that need to be weighed up.
Efi, would you like to chip in on that? Because I think we have a variety of innovation hubs and sandboxes in play in Europe and across the world now at this stage. And obviously consumer protection and financial stability are key. But have you any thoughts on that, how those models are working?
Well, clearly from the experience that we've had in Europe, it shows that smaller jurisdictions have been able to innovate faster and work faster and better with the regulators, just because, you know, common sense of a small size. And we have many examples of those, from Baltic countries to, you know, even Switzerland. It's just smaller, is easier to communicate and work together in many in many respects. It goes from payments to, I would say, the more sort of cutting edge technologies like blockchain that are even more complicated to understand in an even more experimental phase. What is not clear and what is not happening is the harmonization of these changes across regulatory jurisdictions. On the contrary, I think through the last 5 at least years of FinTech innovation, we've had competition, jurisdictional, if you want, competition and shopping even within Europe, which, I mean, on the one hand is sad, on the other hand, it might be healthy and might force others to adopt regulations. So this is what I've been seeing in Europe.
Very good. Tony, would you like to chip in on that, that competition angle?
Yeah, look, I think there is competition, JB. I also think there's two different things happening. I think in some parts of the world, including the US, there's a much greater focus on how can you use innovation to bring more people into the market. Over in UK, Ireland, and countries like that, the competition has tended to be how can I take on the incumbents, which, you know, and they're very different models. And I think, you know, one thing that we should be trying to do is, you know, how do we make sure that we can bring more people into the financial system right across the board? So competition clearly is good, but competition that really is just moving deck chairs around doesn't achieve a lot. I would like to see that there is probably, to Efi's point, there's a greater sense, you know, how do we lift all boats, as opposed to how do we have competition working in some parts but not in other parts. So I think there's a broader question that we need to look at.
Okay, and I can see where competition in the UK initially started from the perspective of driving more challenger banks, and it was an internal competition, but has gone far beyond that at this stage. And it has certainly stimulated definitely an atmosphere of competition at the regulatory arbitrage level with some countries. I think Ireland has definitely stayed back from that, whereas there is an agenda at the European level to have regulatory convergence. I think the regulatory convergence certainly seems to be moving forward from an Irish perspective. I don't think we certainly haven't been at the sharp edge of competition. The convergence probably is touching lots of different areas, Gerry, and maybe you might like to touch on a few of those areas where we're converging systems and processes and other activities.
Thanks. Yeah, JB. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, we participate in a lot of the European bodies towards that convergence. You know, so you know we're part of that discussion to ensure that there is a movement towards convergence. I think the other thing in terms of cooperation as opposed to competition is some of the work that the Bank of International Settlements is doing. So if you look at the Bank of International Settlements, they've identified innovation in financial services as being absolutely critical. No one is denying the pace and the scale of the change that's already there that will probably only accelerate. The question is, how do central banks and regulatory authorities cooperate to ensure that they share knowledge, they share skills, and they share potential policy responses. So the Bank of International Settlements have set up a number of innovation hubs across the globe at this point, so that various different technologies can be trialed, various different approaches can be trialed. And while we talk a little bit about the innovation within, in a sense, the commercial element of financial services, there's innovation happening within central banks and regulators themselves, because we have to keep pace with all of this technology. We have to ensure that we have the skills to be able to understand this technology, and we have to build our own technology to support everything that is now been thrown at us. So for example, even in terms of our own institution, just pulled out some numbers. I mean, 4 years ago in 2016, we were processing 1 billion records. Now we're at 45 billion records. That's the scale of which has now been thrown upon regulators and central banks as a consequence of trying to keep pace with everything that's there. So while you mentioned the competition, JB, I'd be more concentrating on this cooperation that's happening to try and ensure that, you know, central banks and regulators don't want to be slowing up progress. But what we want to do is ensure that the policy responses are adequate to protect financial stability, protect monetary policy, and to ensure that there isn't exclusion and that, you know, there isn't fragmentation from the point of view of different elements of society, that they have access to safe financial services. So, you know, it's interesting to look at it, I think, from that point of view, JB.
Pretty good.
May I add something to
sorry, Efi.
point, because I'm sure that regulators and central banks are concerned about systemic risks. They're always concerned about the potential of systemic risks. And our last big crisis, the subprime crisis, it was, you know, the issue of huge concentrations and too big to fail institutions. And I'm starting to worry now that a lot of the innovation that is happening in the financial services is cannibalizing a lot of businesses, especially the ones that were based on commissions and so on. And that might result to another kind of concentration of power of the new fintechs and the new houses. So these are issues that are really moving fast and are huge challenges. What are the new systemic risks given the innovative business models?
Very good. Emma, would you like to comment on that, or?
Yeah, and actually just maybe first on the point about convergence, like I think we need to remember as well about competition and convergence. Ireland is a very small market, so actually it suits, I think, and it would be to our benefit and to the benefit of businesses operating in Ireland to have convergence of rules across Europe, because by passporting then you have access to a much bigger market. Each member state having their own individual rules and processes and systems isn't really to the benefit of the smaller member state. But I think, you know, Efi is very right. You know, as things change, the risks change and the profile of risks change. And I suppose as policymakers, you know, a lot of our focus is always on the kind of the end consumer and consumer protection and financial stability. And I think had we been having this conversation maybe 5-6 years ago, you know, a lot of the focus then was financially excluded, and it was the concept of people maybe not having a bank account. And one of the proposals there was that, you know, we brought in a payment accounts directive in I think it was 15 or 16, which gave everybody access to having a bank account. But actually in a few short years, we've moved on so quickly that there's a danger that those who become financially excluded are those that maybe are more challenged dealing with electronic payments or don't want to move towards electronic payments or internet banking. So it's always about being aware that the risks change with time. And I suppose very much, you know, the mantra at European level and I think at national level is always, if you're doing the same activity, you carry the same risks and you need to follow the same rules, whether you're a tech company or you're an old-fashioned bank. If you're in the same business, you have to follow the same rules. And that, you know, so, and regulation is very much, from our perspective, about protecting a consumer and financial stability, not about making life difficult for businesses. That's not the purpose of regulation. Regulation is about the kind of the bigger public policy perspective.
Very good. We have a question in from the audience. There seems to be good potential for consumers in data-driven assistance for budgeting, e.g. Clio, Chip, Plum. I know about Plum, I'm not sure about the others, and other personal finance management tools, but they tend to be targeted towards younger customers. Is it in the interest of policymakers to see the evolution of such such services in mainstream retail banking? It's an interesting adjunct now to the last conversation. Tony, would you like to chip in on that?
Yeah, look, I think anything that can help consumers to understand their finances and to make the right life decisions is important. I think the challenge comes with a JB, you know, reference to data there. The challenge comes to understand, you know, if we move into a world that's driven by algorithms that are making decisions on behalf of customers, we need to make sure that we understand how those algorithms determine those outcomes. So I would think absolutely, once we're clear on, you know, what the end game will be for the customer, because there's a big difference between customer satisfaction and a good customer outcome. So you might have the customer thinking this is fantastic, but it may not actually be in their best interest. So I think there's a challenge that comes with it, but I'm all for it once it's done right.
Yeah, I sometimes worry with this digital or technology enabled services that have chipped away a lot at the payment business of the retail banks. Now we're seeing any of the, with Plum, with Raisin, with others, other saving alternatives and alternative saving tools as well, that we're going to see a lot of the savings potential for retail banks be chipped away as well. And that's going to be a real pity, and it's a real worry, I think, for your traditional retail bank, which is consolidating and retreating to the center. It's away from branches, away from people. And the only way to touch and engage with a bank is through a device. If we go back 20 or 30 years, banking was a location. You went there and you did banking. And now banking is a technology or a tool, or it's a service, it's a mobile app. You know, so I do worry about that. Anybody like to chip in on that?
I worry also about the fact that you know, we have a lot of fragmentation, all these FinTech apps, Clio and personal finance apps, there's many of them. But none of them really see the whole picture of a person, and therefore what you can do on one app might not be in your best interest. And for me, the best example of that is, you know, this hot trend now for buy now, pay later, where, you know, you can easily buy either a small item or a larger item, you know, a refrigerator or a car with these installments, right? And it's fantastic because they don't have interest payments for a couple of months. God forbid, of course, if you're delayed. But the question is, they can't see if that's in my best interest, financial interest. When I'm executing, I have to make that decision, and I'm not able to make it because we can't see the whole data. So there's many of those. We've got thousands of apps. That is a problem. We have not progressed on that front. We've got more and more FinTech apps. Okay,
so progress has been fast.
And JB, I think the other question around this is the whole area of financial education and the awareness and understanding. And sometimes we think that it's, you know, my generation or the older generation that's kind of excluded from the technology because they're not used to it. But perhaps some of the younger generation, with the multiplicity of apps that they're used to in their daily lives, maybe don't ask some of the questions that they should be asking in terms of understanding what they're getting into. And like, it's really important that the firms themselves are educating their consumers, or their customers rather, as to the full extent. So, you know, understanding the full information is something that's really important in the context of anybody getting into financial services or any of these products, or even the sharing of their data. or part of their data in the context of these products. So I think that broad question of the education of people to be wary and to be cognizant of what they're getting into is really important.
JB, I think this all comes back to first principles. What are you trying to do for who and why? And everything has to come from the customer's perspective. So if we really understand our customers and we understand their needs and we're designing products and services and innovating around that, well, we're off to a good start. So the technology, to me, the technology is just the enabler. It helps you achieve on behalf of your consumer. But if you start with the technology, you'll have a lot of innovation around technology, but how far will that really go? And then you run the risk that actually it's innovation for the company's sake as opposed to the customer's sake. And I would like to see a much greater emphasis, particularly from incumbents, understand exactly what it is we're trying to do for customers and why.
Is there any concern about that, just on packaging everything up with a service at the end of it, with the AI on top of it? And this application knows best, it's making the answer for you, but this is all tied back to that company making a profit and adding customers.
Yeah, I think if you can show that it's a good customer outcome, JB, that's fine. But I do have a personal concern that there's boards and management teams that are not quite clear on how the algorithms are making decisions, learning and making new decisions. And I would say, if we're centered on the customer outcome and a great customer experience, that's fine. If we lose sight of that, that's where you run the risk of having all sort of problems, be you a new entrant or an incumbent.
Okay. Any thoughts on that? Any fears around that from the panel members? Too much insight, too much data, optimized solutions. I'd like all your savings. I can make all the decisions for you. Am I really the right choice? I'm comparing my service with nothing else. And I worry that the consumers are uneducated, not informed, maybe don't understand their choices and the impact of their choices.
Well, I think that's very much what we focused on. I think, JB, is the culture in organizations. So whatever about the technology, you can have great technology, but if the culture of the organization is not conducive to what Tony said in terms of good outcomes for their customers, then the technology is just a vehicle. So regulating technology or thinking that it's great, inherently great, is no use without that culture. And we've seen that from the big institutions right down to the small. So, that's something that we consciously look out for. And Tony mentioned boards, and I think we've been, again, very public in terms of saying our expectation of what boards need to know and understand in terms of what's going on within organizations is never more important, particularly in the area of technology, when, it's not necessarily the specialism of board members to understand and ask the questions that you point out, which is, so we're introducing something, we've got AI in a firm now. Well, the questions that need to be asked are the ones that have been posed here today. Are there inherent biases in that AI? Do we know how it works? Do we know what's behind it? Do we know the implications of it? So, it is a really important thing, I think, for us to understand that, the culture of these organizations is pointing in the right direction.
Very good. Efi, what do you on boards? Are you seeing those questions being asked at some of the senior management groups?
And there are many biases that have been detected. I mean, anecdotal evidence. A good example is when Apple announced their collaboration with Goldman, I believe, to issue an Apple card. I think just a couple of months after there was, it was publicly announced that the algorithm that was deciding on who gets approved to get the Apple card had a bias against women. So a couple would apply and the husband would get the card and the wife wouldn't get the card. And basically they had the same, financial statements and so on. So that's a small example of what can happen. But overall, to tell you the truth, right now, I'm not worried so much, simply because I think that the the actual AI, even narrow AI penetration in financial services is still very, very low. I mean, most incumbents are still dealing with integrating, creating data lakes, getting rid of silos, cleaning up data to be able to get meaningful analytics and real value out of that. Maybe some of the fintechs that are very narrowly focused are using AI, you know, for, let's say, credit approval and so on. But again, it's very low level and narrowly focused. So I would say it's a worry going down the road. And when we solve the data problems that exist in the financial services still, which is, you know, where we are not able to use data really well. We don't have really big data, and we refuse to pool meaningful data, despite the fact that regulation, especially in Europe, is allowing us to do it. There's a cultural resistance still.
Emma, did you want to chip in there?
No, I was sort of just making some of the points that Efi mentioned, and also I think just to Gerry's point in terms of, you know, very much at the heart of all policy development is the concept of consumer protection, and it is around the, you know, expectation that businesses put the customer at the center. And a lot of activity in the recent years has been about ensuring that businesses know the customer they're dealing with, and that they give the information to the customer in a simple manner. But, you know, not to say there's still a lot of work to be done in it, but really I think financial education is a key piece, and the idea of shopping around and comparing the product you're being offered by players is really important. And, you know, there's still a lot to be done, I think, in that space.
Right. Tony, do you have any thoughts on that whole price comparison, people switching, people looking at different providers? Are they looking at the phone for that answer? Are they talking to their friends? Are they, you know, going to different financial services providers on the high street?
I think there's a little bit of that happening, JB, but to be honest with you, I think the problem in most markets is concentration. So, you know, the market is basically, you know, the majority of customers are with 4 or 5 institutions, and Ireland is no different from that. So I think the question for Ireland really is, you know, we're a small market, as being said. You know, we have I mean, I think in context we're compared to Birmingham, so we have a small market. So the question for us is, how do we innovate at an international level using Ireland as a hub? Because I think there's only so far you can go in a population of 4.8 million people. But if we are if we're at the center of Europe post-Brexit, how are we using that to innovate right across Europe? And I'm encouraged to see, you know, developments like GFIN, where it's, you know, cross-jurisdictional testing of products and services. And I think Ireland has a role to play in something like this. And I think we should be going for it. So it's a question, how do we get that type of innovation going? So yes, we have Ireland, it's a small test market, but really actually we're looking to drive international financial services out of Ireland.
Good. And probably from my own perspective just on that is just, I think we are a small market, but there is unreal expectation on the breadth or maybe our reach as well. We could pick a few areas and be good at a few areas. And we are very good, let's say, at funds and some other large back office. But then I think there's an unreal expectation in that we can be good at everything. We will never be as big as, you know, the FinTech market in the UK. But I know there's a lots of demand to have, why don't we have a sandbox? You know, why don't we have a sandbox in Ireland? If we had a sandbox in Ireland, probably it would have to cater for a huge breadth of technologies, and I'm not sure that we have the people sitting on the bench to be able to help those companies. Where in the UK they have a broader infrastructure. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe Efi or Tony?
I think that, you know, the sandbox doesn't need to cover, you know, all the sub-verticals, if you want, of financial services. it can be, focused on in, let's say, 3 areas. And also it's a question, is it more focused at the B2C level or B2B level? And then maybe under those, a couple of areas that make sense for the Irish market. It's clear it can be done. Why not?
Tony?
Yeah, no, I agree with Efi on that. I think there's probably 2 things. I think we should have a sandbox, personally speaking, and I agree with Efi, a focused sandbox. But I also think we need to bring up the education, not just of consumers, but within financial services. So, we now have an MSc in FinTech. We should have one probably years ago. But we need to be making sure that we are educating people to come into this market, and they don't have to come from a financial services background, but we need to give them the skills to be able to fulfill their role in this market and help us develop.
So I'm just going to play the other side of that argument out. If startups in Ireland, okay, that want to leverage a sandbox, for the most part, I would say, and I think it would be a fair comment, they actually want to trade internationally. They don't want to trade in Ireland. It's too small a market. So the regulators in Ireland and that infrastructure has to approve them to say, yeah, you're good enough, okay, and reliable enough and safe enough to trade all over Europe, and you can passport your services in. And I think that's where there's a huge amount of hesitancy, maybe in some instances, and lack of expertise and possibly knowledge as well. So we have a sandbox in that we have an innovation hub, which is an innovation hub plus model. You can contact them as many times as you want. We don't call it a sandbox. And I know that causes some angst for some of the companies that might want to set up, but I don't think that I don't think it's on the roadmap, I would say. And I'm not asking Gerry to answer this or Emma to get into this, because I think it's a different argument for them. But I'm quite happy, Tony, if you want to kind of maybe play the other part of this argument.
Yeah, well, look, I think a sandbox is better than an innovation hub. That's my personal view. I think innovation hubs are great in terms of getting direction. And do I need to do this? Will it fall within that regulation? But I think sandbox moves you into a space where you're actually experimenting, with real customers, with real products and services, with real technologies. And I think there's nothing like testing that and also having the regulator, by your side. And I think the experience from the UK is that firms that have come through sandbox have been more successful at raising funds and typically raise about 15% more. So I'm personally disposed towards sandbox. I think it would be a good idea for Ireland, and I would like to see us move that way.
Efi, what are your thoughts in the space?
I think all Europe that is looking to benefit from passporting from different jurisdictions would be very happy to see some flow coming from Ireland versus the small countries that most of them are coming from right now. So I do think that that it will be very welcome.
Very good. So just moving on from, I suppose, maybe just broadening it out again, are there other areas, other challenges within stimulating innovation and supporting innovation in Ireland? Can the universities be doing more? Can the existing pillar banks be doing more? The insurance companies, or is everybody in their own trench with their head down working away? But there isn't a lot of collaboration or connection with the startups and the fintechs.
I think, Gerry, sorry, JB, I think there is some collaboration, and I think there is some attempts at collaboration. I'm just wondering how joined up it really is, though. I think universities have a big role to play. I think, first and foremost, the students are all digital natives. So, that's a good starting point in terms of their understanding of technologies and understanding of what they want into the future. I think there's opportunities for universities and existing players to work together to figure out, well, how can these technologies be brought to bear in the marketplace? So I think there's a lot that can be done to accelerate this. And I think, while we have our FS 2025 plan, I'd like to see more emphasis on collaboration right across the board and have more parties working together to try bring it about.
Emma, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see any gap?
Sure. I agree with the points Tony made, and I think actually universities are a really key part to play. And I'm aware UCC have played a big role in working with DG FISMA on a number of proposals over the years and number of innovations. And I think universities are a good place where you can bring the various parts together. You can do the research part, you can take the wider perspective, you can do smaller projects, etc. So I think universities are key. I think it will have to be a collaborative role going forward, because the banks, the incumbents, let's say, have a lot going for them. They have the customers, they have the trust of the customers, they have the information, but they're challenged to do the new digital innovations. The new players often have the good digital ideas, but they struggle to grow the business and to get real depth to their businesses, and to get, customers tend to use them maybe as a second or third option in their financial services world. So, in time, I think it will have to be collaboration across the spectrum of the fintechs, maybe the big techs, the incumbents. And I think where the incumbents are really challenged is often their IT systems. They're bringing large legacy IT systems that struggle to be nimble enough. And that's where maybe, working or collaborating with a tech company can bring them that nimble sort of structure that they struggle to grow organically themselves.
Very good. So I mean, my thoughts are that as we look at this API-driven environment that we're moving into, it's payments as a service or banking as a service, or it doesn't matter, infrastructure as a service, that it will let the existing incumbents hopefully transform faster, and hopefully will let new challengers, whether they're based in Ireland or other locations, shape a tailored solution. It's kind of nearly like one-of-a-kind solution for whichever consumer you happen to be. They can reshape and remodel something to target you as a consumer. Are we getting to the situation where it's faster for consumers to patch something together that they really will really suit their needs, and also enable those fintechs or big techs to insert themselves into this model? I think banks are severely challenged, but what's our future going to look like? Is our relationship with banking going to be a series of icons on our mobile phone, which is actually related? Those icons are related to a series of services that exist in a cloud, someplace in Europe, if they're going to be regulated in Europe. Is that where we're going, Efi or Gerry?
Is the question more about whether banking will become invisible and up on the cloud? Yes, definitely. I mean, think of it. Most of us still have 2 or 3 financial services providers. Probably because of inertia, our primary service provider is an incumbent, and maybe our second or third is some fintech. But that fintech typically doesn't live in our jurisdiction. So we are heading there, clearly. And I don't see why this shouldn't happen. It is to the benefit of the end consumer, and it will facilitate integration of all sorts of other services if we go towards that direction. I mean, this crisis obviously showed to us the importance of not only being on the cloud, but being able to do cloud computations. So I think that we're heading there. Banking is no different than anything else. It's cloud and cloud computing, and that probably for Europe, it has to be in Europe. So I think that we're going there.
I have another question in here from one of our viewers. If you mentioned that financial services are not able to use data well and refuse to pool data despite being empowered to by the EU, why is that? Is the question.
I mean, the first response is that most of the data, the amount, as Emma said, is with incumbent institutions. And because of the way the organizations have been run with silos between different businesses, the data is not pulled together. It's not clean. It's very difficult to clean it up because it's not real-time data that you can analyze on the spot. Most data in incumbent financial services is it has a delay until it really is recorded in the data pool and validated and confirmed. And it's a big challenge and a business challenge to integrate the data. And quite frankly, there might not be the business incentives within a large incumbent institution to share that data and do that. So that's the reality of it.
Yeah, and I think JB, just following on that, I think part of this is culture. You need to have a data culture. If you look at an Amazon or an Alibaba, these guys are all about the data. They need the data because they make their business decisions real time based on data. Incumbent organizations, that's not the world they grew up in. And data is something that, they're increasingly getting better at, but it's not part of their DNA. And as Efi says, yeah, they tend to be siloed, and, different departments or different, SBUs or whatever they might be, have different data, maybe even on the same customer. So I think until you get to a stage where, it is a single view of the customer. And when I look at financial institutions, I always look at their P&L. And usually I can get information on products or channels, but I don't really get information on customers. So a lot of institutions, they're essentially built around products or channels, and they're not built around customers, yet we talk about being customer-centric. And if you're customer-centric, data will be at the heart of what you do. And I just don't see that happening, maybe with some of the fintechs, but as has been acknowledged, they tend to be small, so it's easier. But they're starting from a space of understanding the data. And that's what we need to see right across the board.
May I add to this? There's a famous memo that Jeff Bezos sent, apparently, I don't know how many years ago, internally to the company, and said that the company has to work 100% through APIs. Whoever doesn't comply will be fired. So imagine that you have an incumbent bank and the CEO says that, departments and everybody has to work through APIs, no other way, right? Imagine if you can do that kind of transformation. That is where we should be heading to, but it's fairly impossible, as Emma said, because of the legacy systems.
Very good.
And JB, that's not unique. I worked in the telco industry for years, and it was exactly the same issue, right? In terms of the telco and the old fixed line business, and not having the mindset for the new mobile business or the new internet business. So it is very difficult for big incumbent operators who've been there for years and years and have built up 30 or 40 years worth of legacy systems. And they end up cannibalizing their own revenue streams at times as well, which is another issue for them, right? I don't know whether you saw a piece in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago. Anne Bowden, who used to be the chief operating officer in AIB, wrote a book recently about leaving AIB. She went in for a short period of time, leaving AIB, and then gone off and setting up Starling Bank in the UK. And the different issues in terms of culture and what it's like an incumbent versus what's like in a startup. And I'm not saying anything about AIB. You could take any incumbent. It is just really challenging, I think, to take all of these things on.
Very good. So I know we only have a few minutes left, but it would be interesting just to get your perspectives on what are the additional opportunities and challenges that Brexit will bring to financial services in Ireland? Any immediate thoughts on that? Tony, do you have some ideas? We'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I think we've kind of touched on some of this already. I think if the UK pulls out of Europe and Ireland is within Europe, we've already seen the movement of a range of firms to Ireland. The question is, how can we build on that and encourage more firms that want to operate in a European market come to Ireland and do their innovation and then take that innovation into those markets. So I think that it's an opportunity. I think that it brings some interesting opportunities for Ireland to really ramp up its, maybe to Efi's point, pick the areas. There's no point in trying to compete on everything. Pick those ones that we really want to be good at, and then build on it.
Excellent. Emma, did you want to say anything?
Well, no, I'd agree. I think it will bring opportunities. It will bring challenges. I suppose, the UK has always been a big financial centre. It will continue to be a big financial centre. And I think it'll be important we continue to have a close relationship with them. A lot of the financial innovation that we've seen in the last number of years has come out of London. So I think it'll be important that we, remain connected to that, and that the EU is connected with it as well. So, hopefully a partnership and working together going forward. But a lot of, we will see new players move to Ireland, I think, to do their business into Europe that might traditionally have gone to London.
Very good. And Gerry, did you want to mention anything?
No, I mean, that presents the ongoing challenge for us is to ensure that we're on top of all of these new firms coming in. I mean, there's been significant pressure in terms of authorizations, etc. That will continue, and managing the risk. So, in a sense, for us, it's just expanded the workload that we have to do. But then there's the broader issues as well that others have covered, so I won't go into that.
Excellent. Efi?
I think that Ireland has to be careful not just to be the place that startups are coming for the passporting. It is a great opportunity to do much more, to keep them really there and benefit and have the ripple effects of the innovation really being there that is passported to Europe, but basically to become a hub of these pan-European, if you want, companies. So this is what needs to be done. It's not only to have, if you want, the presence only for that reason. You want the teams to be there, to have a significant part of their workers being there and infiltrating the ecosystem of Ireland.
Okay, and that's a good point. I think Ireland has always been very good, has been a fantastic location for foreign direct investment, whereas we don't have a huge amount of unicorns or other large companies in any industry vertical that have grown from Ireland. Now there are definitely several, but a lot have maybe been sold or at an early stage. Some people would say, look, it doesn't matter as long as we're getting those companies to base here. We're providing jobs for the people in Ireland. There's less migration abroad. Question here about the status of open banking and its penetration in terms of how open are banks in terms of allowing TPPs into their ecosystem. Any thoughts on that? Maybe Tony?
Yeah, look, I think notwithstanding all the noise about open banking, we're still at early days in terms of market acceptance, both at an institutional level and at a customer level. So I think it will increase over time, JB, but I think we're still at very early days. And someone was making the point, I think it might have been Emma or Efi, in terms of, customers have their main bank and then their main other institutions they use for tickets. I think it's going to be a slow enough journey, but I think the framework will be in place that if the consumers demand it, it can happen. But you're not going to have the institutions rushing to make it happen.
I've seen it happen. I'm not sure is someone talking about a bank in particular, but I've definitely seen it happening from an open banking perspective with AIB and Bank of Ireland. So I'm not sure, is there something else in relation to that question? Okay, and I know we're just about to hit time now. Does anyone have any parting comments on progress? Too fast, too slow, just about right, like my porridge?
I think we need to make more. I think we have the wherewithal to make more. I think, it's interesting, we're talking about digital transformation. I think, when we come back in 3-5 years time, we won't be talking about digital at all. We'll be just talking about the way we do things. And I think we are going to continue to progress. It's a question of, making sure that we have all the infrastructure, the education, the supports in place, and that we do it right and that we deliver good customer outcomes. So I think it's a big opportunity, and I think we need to keep pushing ahead.
Very good. Any other thoughts, or will we leave it at that, guys? Okay, thank you all. Panelists, it's been great. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we've touched on some tangent to all of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. So hopefully all the viewers enjoyed it, and we look forward to the next one in the series, which will happen next year. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.